Welcome to the Australia-India Institute webinar, Beyond 2021 Geopolitical Opportunities for the Australia-India Relationship. I'm Lisa Singh, I'm the Director and CEO of the Australia-India Institute, and I would start by acknowledging that I am meeting with you today from the lands of the Gadigal people. And I also acknowledge the traditional custodians of the various lands on which all of you work and join us today, and pay my respects to the elders both past and present, and extend that respect to other Aboriginal and Torres Strait Islanders who are present today. Part of our role at the Australia-India Institute is to increase the policy and public importance of India as a crucial partner in Australia's future, and of Australia as a crucial partner in India's future, and to provide leadership on a closer and mutually beneficial relationship. And that Australia-India relationship is certainly on a high at the moment. Despite the challenges of COVID-19, the elevation of the relationship to a comprehensive strategic partnership has raised the profile of both countries' common interests and commitment to work together in various areas of political and economic significance. But the question remains, with common concerns over the ever-changing geopolitical environment in the Indo-Pacific region and the need to safeguard our national interests, how can the potential of this new partnership be realised into 2022 and beyond? And will the resurgence of the Quad provide that anchor for a free and open Indo-Pacific region for both nations? So to unpack this today, I am delighted to be joined by John McCarthy AO, former Australian Ambassador and Distinguished Fellow of the Australia-India Institute and Senior Advisor to AsiaLink. Welcome, John.
Well, thank you. Thank you very much, Lisa. Very nice to see you.
Look, as many listeners would know today, John McCarthy is one of Australia's most celebrated career diplomats. John's posts have included Ambassador to Vietnam, Mexico, Thailand, the United States, Indonesia, Japan, and High Commissioner to India. His assignments in the Department of Foreign Affairs and Trade included Chief of Staff to the then Foreign Minister Andrew Peacock, Chief Legal Officer and Deputy Secretary. And since leaving DFAT in 2009, John McCarthy has been National President of the Australia Institute of International Affairs, Chair of the Australia-India Council, co-convener of the Australian-Indonesia Dialogue, Chair of the Advisory Board of the Griffith Asia Institute, and John continues to contribute to the Australian public conversation on significant foreign affairs and geopolitical issues. So we are delighted to have John for this webinar today. Today's webinar will begin with an in-conversation between John and myself for about half an hour or so. And then there'll be an opportunity for audience interaction via the Q&A function. So I encourage audience members to use the Q&A box at the bottom of your screens to submit your questions. So John McCarthy, firstly, I wanted to ask you about your role as an Australian diplomat and the importance of diplomacy. Can you share with me what Australia's diplomacy with India was like when you were Australian High Commissioner to India?
Well, I guess, Lisa, I came into a period where India was just beginning to come into fashion, and this was being recognised in Australia. We'd had periods really since India's independence where there had been an acceptance on both sides that we needed to do more about the relationship, but it had really never got anywhere. And things really actually got quite bad in 1998 when India and then Pakistan tested nuclear warheads. And the Australian reaction was very sharp, and some thought sharper than was necessary given the reaction of other countries to the issue. And it took a while to really, I think, begin to accept two things which would really make a difference to our relationship with India. First, the fact that, from the beginning of the century, it was clear that the Indian economy was rising. It was going to become a great power economically at some stage, and that we couldn't ignore this and needed to do our best to become involved in a much stronger economic relationship with India. I think the second factor was a growing appreciation that with the rise of China, there needed to be other balances in the region to Chinese growth. That wasn't only, of course, maintenance of the United States presence in the region, but enhancing India's own political clout and perhaps to a lesser degree military clout, but enhancing that as a means of counterbalancing China. So those were really the two big things. And gradually that appreciation crept into government, crept into the media here. And I think there was a growing appreciation with all parties, but it was around about, in my view, about 2005, 2006, that Prime Minister Howard realised he got India. He saw where it really fitted into Australia's strategic outlook. So that's, and from then on in, I think things have grown. We've put more missions in. We've now got 4 consulate general, I think, on top of the embassy in Delhi. And the relationship is regarded as a much more mature one for the sorts of reasons you outlined in your introduction. The problems with India, just initially, you pointed out the student problem. That was a real issue for about 6 months. Most of you, I think, will remember that, but that was not well handled, particularly at our end, but in the end it was sorted out. But that's been the only really serious, problem we've had, 15 years.
John, we might touch back on the role of prime ministers in the relationship, since those days of John Howard's engagement. But you did just touch on the Indian students' attacks on students in Melbourne. That was an issue when you were High Commissioner. And I think heightened by, I remember at the time, by the media, and, it really did set back the relationship there for a moment. You obviously navigated those challenges, but how does that compare, that sort of craft of diplomacy that you engaged at that moment, at that critical moment? How does that compare to the sort of craft we see in Australian diplomacy today?
Well, I guess there were 2 elements that, two main approaches we took in India to deal with that issue. At first, trying to explain to the leadership, not only in Delhi, but particularly in those states where there were large numbers of students who had come from those states and were in Australia, and there was a lot of anxiety, of course, amongst their families and so on. And they were particularly, I recall, Andhra Pradesh was one, and there were 2 others, particularly the Punjab and Gujarat. Now, so we really had to try and persuade them that this, was not racist, was not an attack on Indians as such. There were racist elements in it, by the way, and I didn't try and deny that. But a lot of it was basically economic. There were Indians came home late at night, they were very vulnerable, and there were a whole bunch of reasons to do with the circumstances in Melbourne. Anyway, that was one approach. The second approach, which both I and later on my successor Peter Varghese had to undertake, was really going in very hard with the Indian media, and calling press conferences, taking delegations around, not avoiding even, very, let's say, lively television performances, all that side was quite necessary. And I think it actually helped, not immediately, but over a period, the issue settled down much more quickly than I think that we had initially thought.
Look, we've moved away from that, thank goodness. And now, we see our relationship with India in a much stronger footing. But it was, I think, due to the craft of your diplomacy that things were managed so well as with your team and a number of others in Canberra. But now we've sort of looked at the sort of prime ministerial activity in the relationship since John Howard. So one of those I wanted to draw on was the visit in 2014 by Prime Minister Modi, when I think he became the first Indian Prime Minister in almost 3 decades to visit Australia. Right. It's quite a sort of a gap there. But during that visit, he addressed the joint sitting of the Australian Parliament in Canberra, and he stressed on the commonalities between the two nations, and also highlighted that the political and the strategic and economic relations had been below potential. I think he hinted that things would change, and he said Australia will not be at the periphery of our vision, but at the centre of our thought. And I would say that that certainly has been the case now. But what brought about this realisation that the relationship was functioning below its potential, and why hadn't Australia and India been more closely aligned in the past?
Well, I think it was, it was partly basically necessity. I think had geopolitical circumstances not changed, had India's economy not grown at the rate that it did over a number of years, I don't think you would have seen the same changes. But what you did see was several things happening. First of all, the Indians became increasingly conscious and wary of China's growth. They saw it as being necessary to improve their relationship with the United States. That took place over a period. And part of that, and only part of it, I certainly don't want to exaggerate this at all, was the value, the strategic value of Australia as a close ally to the United States. So, and I think the third factor was that there was a recognition globally, but certainly, certainly in India itself, certainly in the United States, and to some degree at that stage, but only to some degree in China, that the Indian Ocean was going to become a greater area of competition. And from that particular perspective, closer relationships with Australia made a lot of sense for India and vice versa.
And well, that's certainly gone from strength to strength in the last little while. Do you think it's fair to say that the sort of the stability and the peace that we want to see in the Indo-Pacific is really what does lie at the heart of this bilateral relationship? Or is it myopic to view this relationship as one that's primarily aimed at balancing China? Do you think we need to view and understand the Australia-India relationship beyond just those strategic lines?
Well, I think those lines are, the sort of the main elements. I think the China factor is very important to America, to Indian strategic thinking, particularly in the last year and a half or so, when sees itself as threatened in the Himalayas. But that is important, but it's not, and that is one of the reasons why the Quad, Japan, the United States, Australia, and India have become closer in the last year or so. However, it shouldn't, I think, get in the way of two other factors. One, the Indians adhere very strongly to the concept of strategic autonomy. So you're not going to get them in the sort of alliance relationships which we or the Japanese have with the Americans. That's simply not going to happen. What you will see, I think, with the Quad is a greater alignment of policies generally, not just military policies, not just exercises, but doing the sorts of things that certainly the Quad have been attempting to do with mixed results in combating COVID-19. If I could just add one other point, the Quad is important, and I don't think the Quad is going to decline anytime soon. In fact, I think there are strategic imperatives to suggest it will become more important in the thinking of certainly the four countries involved in the Quad itself. What is going to be very, very important is to ensure that in that process, ASEAN's role as a major structure in the region is not diminished. They're sensitive as to what the Quad is doing. They're accepting of it with varying degrees of perspective around ASEAN, but they're very, very conscious of it, and they see it positively in a sense, because they too are nervous about aspects of Chinese policy, but they also see it as something which can, in fact, raise tensions in the region. They're careful about how they put that publicly, but it is certainly one of the sentiments in ASEAN, which I think is important, and which our diplomacy, and that's the diplomacy of the four of us, are most conscious of. Of the four countries, I think the best at it are the Japanese by a long way. I think they've handled Southeast Asia much, much better than certainly the United States. India and Australia, I think, would be the bottom two of the four. But you know, this is important. That ASEAN factor has to be taken into account in our own geopolitics, with India, of course, but within the Quad more generally.
Yeah, that's a really interesting point about ASEAN in terms of what we've already seen. Of course, there's already been so many, there's been a range of actions and high-level discussions of late in the region, not just through the Quad and the leaders at that leaders summit level in Washington, but also because of AUKUS. That so much activity in terms of raising questions on the role of the Quad in balancing China, but also the important ASEAN factor you raised there as well. Look, I think just on the Quad, John, India has never been much, it's never really much like the Quad. Now they're very much a key member, committed to, I think they've committed to a range of initiatives, delivering $1.2 billion vaccines through the Indo-Pacific under the Quad's work plan. But do you think that India's sort of reasoning for becoming more of a sort of rusted on member is due to those border disputes with China? I mean, I know you mentioned that just before, because it just strikes me that they seem to be all in now in terms of the Quad, but why that has come about is worth exploring.
Yeah, I don't think, people will dispute this, but I don't think they are as strong a member of the Quad as the other three. I just think they've got too many other factors that guide their strategic policy. They're certainly very anxious about the Himalayas, but I don't think they're unduly anxious about what is happening in the South China Sea. An Indian naval officer would probably deny that, but I think I'm pretty right there. On the Quad, yes, they're getting stronger, no question, and much of it had to do with the Himalayas, much of it. But I still think they're a bit behind the game compared with the other three, But yes, there has been a change in their policy, no question about it. On AUKUS, you mentioned AUKUS. The Indians haven't actually had a lot to say on AUKUS. AUKUS is, I think, going to be, most people in Australia, I think, would be sort of behind it insofar as they have a view at all. But there are aspects of AUKUS that we have to be, careful of. We work, and we're working harder with India. We're working harder with Japan and have been for much longer. But AUKUS is bringing the Anglosphere back into this region with a certain ferocity. And I think we need to be careful of that. We've spent 50 years working with the Southeast Asians as an ex-dominion working in their particular geographic environment. And so, bringing back AUKUS, Brits, Americans, of course, they're an ally of ours, and ourselves, with the fanfare and the, frankly, political mishandling of much of it, I think is going to leave quite a complicated couple of years, not just for us, but for the Americans. I mean, look at the problems the Americans are having, particularly with France, but in Europe more generally. Since you've mentioned AUKUS, I see no harm in commenting on it. But it's not something that seems to be a big deal. It's certainly noticed and commented on in India, but it's not right to the forefront of their thinking, I don't think.
Well, look, I was going to ask you about the sort of the relevance of AUKUS to India, but before I do that, John, I wanted to just sort of delve into Australia's handling in cancelling the French deal to join our English-speaking member states. Mm-hmm. There's clearly been a fundamental shift in Australia's strategic thinking and therefore circumstances there. You recently said in an article in the Australian Financial Review, and I quote, you said, "For us, hype aside, the saddest thing about the recent shift is it diminishes the serious Australian diplomatic effort with Asia over 50 years or so, including the post-Vietnam bolstering of ASEAN and the building of APEC and so on." So could you please elaborate on this a bit more? You just touched on it then, but is it seriously, are we seriously that diminished through this shift with AUKUS?
We've got problems. The degree to which our efforts have been diminished, people will argue about. I think it's caused us problems and will continue to cause us problems, not in obvious, loud-mouthed, megaphone diplomacy, but in perceptions of where our interests really lie in the region. We work very, very hard over a long period, and you have to look at APEC, the East Asia Summit, the support for ASEAN itself in the 60s, the work that was done bringing Indochina back into Southeast Asia, and after all, Australia really led the charge on the whole Cambodian settlement, which brought to an end to the Vietnam War. So, our role wasn't small in any of that. And, although people, nobody accepted our policies all of the time, of course not, there was a sense that most of the time we were really trying to engage the region seriously. I think AUKUS knocks that back. How much, I don't know, but I'm pretty sure it knocks it back. I know that there are sort of feeling senses in places like Indonesia and Singapore and Thailand that, is this the real Australians? Are these the people we've been dealing with for 50 or 60 years? In the end, it's, the British Empire. It's obviously Canada and New Zealand are not in it, but I should say, probably a better way of putting it is the Americans plus the British Empire. The French don't help that either, by the way. I mean, I can assure you, I don't think they're leaving that issue alone totally.
Well, I think their ambassador's back, so perhaps we're slowly on a mend. But
pretty slowly. Yeah.
Look, I think bring it back to India, though. India has been pretty silent on AUKUS. Why do you think that's the case?
Oh, I think, a couple of reasons. Well, I think in terms of having a strong Australian Navy and a stronger Australian Navy in 20 years hence, it's going to take a while. All that is a plus, because I think they see the Western presence in the Indian Ocean as being valuable. And again, much of this has to do with China. I don't think there's any doubt about the way they look at that. But at the same time, they're less so in the last year. There's always been a measure of caution in India's dealings with China. They don't go as far as the Americans, certainly, or let alone us, nor do they go as far as the Japanese. In certain circumstances, they vary. They get very, very anxious about the concept of being surrounded in the Indian Ocean by Chinese assets, by ports which have substantial Chinese ownership. They're concerned about the growth of the Chinese Navy and the expansion of that Navy into the Indian Ocean. So, all that is a bit of a plus. But there is always a measure of caution in their dealings with China. Every issue they say to themselves internally, is this an issue we want to get into, or is this an issue we stay out of? If it's the Himalayas, they haven't got any choice. If it's to do with certain maritime issues close to their coast, they don't have any choice. But they don't get into every diplomatic gunfight to do with China that is around, unlike some other countries.
Hence their sort of strategic autonomy that you referred to earlier. Which
is very important, and which means inter alia that they're not going to be involved in an alliance. The Quad will not become an alliance. And that's a lot of that's to do with India.
I think also, in terms of AUKUS, two of the countries in AUKUS are part of the Quad. So, the good company that India is already partnering with in the Quad, in that sort of grouping that it is, they've got strong relationships with all of a sudden as well.
And that's a good point.
Look, all of these developments recently, the AUKUS, the elevation of the Quad to the leadership level, what does it mean for the order of, the sort of regional order of the Indo-Pacific? What does it, and also, in that sense, I guess, what does it mean for this burgeoning sort of Australia-India bilateral relationship?
Well, I guess what it means depends on where you're looking from. The Chinese would see it as a propensity on the part of the Americans essentially to revive the same sort of thinking as the Cold War, a desire to maintain not only regional supremacy but global dominance as well. That's how the Chinese would see it, as an attempt to prevent China from assuming its rightful place as a very big, economically powerful country, not according it the respect it believes it deserves. That's how they would see it. The Americans, of course, look at it in the Western way. They don't like the system, but above all, it's about great power relationships. It's about authority. It's about power. I don't think I would be. Americans would think I was doing them a disfavor if I were to say that they are concerned not just about the bad things and the difficult things that China is doing, but they're concerned about China's increased authority at their expense, above all in the Asia Pacific, but globally as well, but above all in the Asia Pacific. And that, of course, is one of the reasons why they have put, Biden particularly has put so much more emphasis on the Asia Pacific in the last 4 or 5 months. Part of the reason, I think it's only part of the reason for the withdrawal from Afghanistan. And it's not, all this is going to cause them difficulties. This is not straightforward. For example, I think this issue with the French is a difficult one for them to deal with. And they've made that pretty clear. I mean, the Secretary of State spends 3 days in Paris trying to sort it out. There are telephone conversations across the Atlantic and so on at head of state level. So, you know, it's a big issue. And you could make an argument that the diplomacy slipped a bit, for Americans as well as for others.
Well, I think that diplomacy, or at least the shock, well, there's the French episode, if we call it, but there's also the fall of Afghanistan, and you just touched on that a moment ago, that I think was another sort of shock in the sense of how quickly Afghanistan did indeed fall. You know, the developments there concern the entire world. Not only are there sort of emerging sort of security concerns, but also now fears of a looming humanitarian crisis. How, you know, considering India's relationship to Afghanistan, how much, you know, are these concerns material to India? Do you think they'll have that sort of impact on India, or at least on the stability in the Indo-Pacific with now the Taliban in charge?
Well, the Indians won't like instability in what they term West Asia anyway. I mean, it's too close to them, and there are too many uncertainties that it throws up that they could do without. But perhaps most important from their perspective is the relationship between the Taliban and Pakistan, which in Indian thinking is important. I mean, the Indians think a great deal about China. They still continue to think a great deal about Pakistan. And so that element of Afghanistan is the most significant one. You know, there seems to be a little bit of an assumption that, you know, now the Americans have walked away from Afghanistan, it's a bit like Vietnam, it's kind of all over, you know, and the problem is getting families out, but the Taliban aren't going to be very nice, and we're going to have to sort out a way to deal with them. All that's right. But the fact of the matter is, there's going to be a lot of geopolitics going on. The Russians have a difficult relationship with Afghanistan that is historical. The Chinese want a workable relationship, and that's partly because of their links with Pakistan, a workable relationship with the Taliban, but they too have considerable difficulties with Islamic extremism. Then not directly, but, you know, indirectly involved, as soon as you get into that region, you have Iran and Israel. Now, Israel hasn't got that same direct interest as in Afghanistan as it does, say, in Iran, but nonetheless, they are not going to be just sitting idly by in Washington, just saying to the Americans, well, you do your thing as you see fit. So what I'm trying to say is, even though the Americans have left Afghanistan, that particular chapter is over. There are all sorts of reasons they're reducing leaving Afghanistan, some true, some not so true. But nonetheless, all that is happening. It doesn't mean to say that this is going to become a quiet region. And I think, you know, as policy thinkers, we have to keep that in mind. There's certainly people in America who haven't lost sight of it at all.
I think we could probably go for a whole nother episode with you, John, on Afghanistan. But look, I did want to raise another conflict issue, well, a conflict in itself happening within the Indo-Pacific region, and that goes to the coup in Myanmar that toppled the democratically elected government, coupled with now Chinese influence in Myanmar and Tatmadaw's close links to Beijing. This has all been very disconcerting to India, no doubt, with its shared border. And even so, I think it was given special mention in the joint statement of the Quad Leaders Summit, the last two Quad statements, I think, in fact. So what should Australia's role be in this conflict, in terms of perhaps it's, strengthening its bilateral relationship with India? How does something like Myanmar factor into that?
Yeah, look, with India, I think we have to keep in close touch with them on what is happening in Myanmar. And insofar as we take a serious interest in Myanmar, they are players. And they want stability there. They're concerned about Chinese influence. But there's also another factor, which perhaps people aren't quite so aware of in Australia. You have in the northeast of India over 40 insurgent groups, some extremely small, some not particularly effective. Now, most of those insurgent groups have easy proximity into Burma and there are Myanmar. And so there is a relationship which neither Myanmar nor India advertise particularly, that border we would prefer to keep reasonably quiet. And for that is one of the reasons why the Indian military in particular are careful how they deal with the Burmese military. And that's another factor in the Indian Burma thing, which I think one needs to know about. From Australia's perspective, it's we certainly need to think of India's view, because it is a big and proximate country and a powerful country. The dilemma, though, really for a country like Australia is between meeting the humanitarian aspirations and perspectives of a large part of the Australian community, the churches and so on. It's the human rights group who take these issues very, very seriously. So, that has to be acknowledged. At the same time, in a policy sense, one has to be careful, I think, not to disturb the more prudent aspects of ASEAN policy towards Burma, because there are people in ASEAN, I'd say probably particularly the Indonesians, but a couple of the smaller countries as well, who are trying to do something to make the situation in Myanmar more acceptable. So you've got to be careful in supporting ASEAN policy without and making sure that we honour our principles, but by the same token, not going all the way with our own humanitarian groups for our own domestic political reasons and so on. It's a very difficult situation to handle. Yeah,
indeed, and it's certainly troubling what's continuing to happen in Myanmar, and I hope ASEAN can play a stronger role in that sense. Look, I've taken the lion's share of our time, John, and there's a number of questions that have come in so far. So I will jump to ask some of those now. Look, one here goes to you as a diplomat, really, in terms of the Australia-India diplomatic relationship. What ways does Australia-India diplomacy tend to be different from diplomacy with other countries?
Good. Actually, it's a very good question. Okay, I think there are certain, much fun is made, often rightly so, that the three really original links between Australia and India were the Commonwealth, cricket and curry. And then everybody sort of sits back and laughs, and then occasionally every sort of 7 or 8 years one of the leaders, usually the Australian side, comes along and says, look, there's got to be more to this relationship than we talk about.
The three C's.
We've got the three C's. We've got to be more significant. So for a long time, I'd say where our relationship with India was significant, comparisons with other countries always difficult. It was significant was that it was underdone, seriously underdone, because we played around with with the Commonwealth and the jokes and ha 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 and cricket and so all this stuff. The difference is that real strategic and economic factors have now come into the relationship. We're not trying to make something heavy, which is light. We're actually trying to put the necessary political energy into a relationship which we believe, for slightly different reasons, matters to both of us. And so there has, I'd say the importance of India, or one of the, is that it has moved from a sort of amiable but rather light on relationship to something which has real strategic and economic significance. That's why, that's why we're getting all these agreements together. That's why we're moving things up from being a strategic relationship to an important strategic relationship. I find this diplomatic language as crazy as most other people do, but you have all sorts of different gradations, and but there it is. The fact is, we're really working on these areas, and we're working also, I think, on some of the other areas which people aren't so aware of, and that is scientific and technological cooperation, where we've done very well for 15 years with the Indians.
Yeah, no, it's definitely an exciting time, and yes, I think the cyber and the critical technology space is going to be a definite area of growth. I think, though, one of the questions, John, we've got is that, despite all of this activity and despite, in spite of this sort of continuing desire to ramp up relations, that discussion and reporting around or relating to India through the Australian media is barely there. Do you have any thoughts on that?
Well, other than to agree with you, I'm not sure that I do. It's not solely a problem, by the way, we have with India. It's a problem we have with most of the region, to tell you the truth. Unless something is really going, say, with Indonesia, as happens, every 3 or 4 years, there'll be something huge which will take the attention of our media, or unless there is a crisis in a particular country, say Myanmar or Thailand. There isn't, I think we only have 6 print media in the whole of Asia. That's including South Asia, India, right across to Japan, from Australian organisations.
And a lot of those bureaus have gone, haven't they?
Yeah. When you bring the ABC, you've got a lot more. I mean, there's more TV and so on, but print media, and that's the heavy stuff. It's just lacking, and I think it's something that as a country, a few people are trying to remedy, but we've got a long way to go. If you compare the coverage out of above all the American press, but the British or the French press or the German press, let alone and the Japanese press, their coverage of Southeast Asia compared with ours is far more detailed and far more subtle and much more helpful, frankly.
Yeah. Look, I hope that does change in the future, but maybe that goes into media ownership, which is perhaps a conversation for another day. I've got a question here, John, about the broad Asian diaspora in Australia and its continued growth. How will the Asian diaspora affect the relationship between the Anglosphere connections that we've now made with Asia over the next few years?
Look, a very good question. I think it will. It already has. I mean, you know, I suppose I was talking relatively. If you see the changes in Australia between the 50s and now, in terms of the sort of society we are, it's enormous. I was essentially, you know, talking in diplomatic terms that, you know, here is a country that was very, very Anglo-spheric and very, very closely linked with the Americans, that moved while retaining those relationships, particularly with the Americans, moved into a period of serious engagement with Asia. The risk is now that we lose that. Now, the counterbalance, and an important part of the counterbalance, is the diaspora. And I think it is now, India actually has the biggest diaspora of those born outside Australia. And so that more than China, and you know, that's very significant. Why I say over a period is I'm looking a bit here at other countries, and the power of the diaspora in America is considerable, and you're now seeing political figures of Indian origin getting right to the top. Kamala Harris is half Indian, but she's obvious. Nikki Haley, I mean, some people talk of her as the next Republican president. But that is happening in that sort of country. It's been happening in Canada. And you look at Britain, you've got 3 or 4 cabinet ministers of South Asian descent, and you've got the Mayor of London. So this is going to, I think, happen here. Won't happen immediately, but it will be a process, and it will impact on the way we deal with India to some degree. And but I think India is a very good case in point. I think China's a different set of circumstances and will turn out differently. But I would see the way the Indian diaspora works here as being reasonably close to the way it's worked in the Anglophone countries, the big Anglophone countries. They'll get into the political process and will affect the political process, and will have influence through that process.
And I think, I very much look forward to that day. I think we also need to remember that it's only just 50 years ago that it was the end of the White Australia policy. So, you know, we've still got a way to go in terms of, leadership engagement of our diasporas here, but hopefully it does indeed improve. Look, before we wrap up, I've got a couple more questions from our audience, and one is an AUKUS question, quite technical, in relation to the hadnt SSBN submarine. India also has its own nuclear attack submarine program. Given that the US has in the past denied to India the SSN technology that it is now offering to Australia, do you think India would be keen to be part of an expanded AUKUS if it were also to be offered that SSN technology? So quite a technical submarine question there, but relevant in terms of the current dynamic.
It's certainly relevant. Look, I just come back here, not so much to my knowledge of India, but my knowledge of the way the United States thinks on these issues. It is, in terms of technology, particularly nuclear technology and particularly nuclear submarine technology, they are very, very cagey, as I understand it, and I have no special knowledge here. Getting the technology that we seem to be getting now was a pretty massive effort. And, you know, what they give to the Brits is not unlimited. And the British are pretty close now. Getting out into other areas with a country such as India or Japan, for that matter. Japan's situation is different because of the whole pacifist element and so on. But I just don't see them doing that. I just think they're too careful, too cautious on that sort of issue. I mean, if the Indians were offered it, they'd say, yeah, yippee, be great. But then, I suspect, and I'm speculating and guessing, you would have a tussle between those who saw the military advantages of getting better American nuclear technology and those that said, look, we get into AUKUS, how much freedom of maneuver does that deprive us of? And, the Indians, in terms of their foreign policy formulation, this issue of strategic autonomy really is very important. And we shouldn't here in Australia, where we think about the Quad as much as we think about it, we shouldn't ignore that strategic autonomy element in the way they think, because it's important.
Absolutely. And look, I think, that the two countries have shown a clear expression of intent to work together in a diverse range of areas beyond just the security areas. I think we touched before on critical technologies. There's also, in terms of the Quad, the deal on low emissions technology, including hydrogen development and low cost solar programs. So it's certainly diverse in terms of our relationship going forward. Can we say that the future of this Australia-India relationship will be shaped depending on the will to work and collaborate along these sorts of diverse areas of sort of mutual and economic and political significance, or will we continue to sort of go down more of a strategic pathway?
Oh, no, I think it's going to broaden out. I think the sorts of things that we're doing with each other in that sort of technological space, all that is going to make a difference. We've had a very successful joint research program between Australian and Indian universities, into which both countries have put a lot of money, not just Australia. Those sorts of initiatives are I think, beginning to bear fruit. So, that area where it's services and technology, there's not actually much happening in the whole manufacturing area between Australia and India, and I can't see it happening much in a hurry. When I say manufacturing, I include minerals in that. I mean, we sell them a hell of a lot of coal, but that's not going to go on forever, I don't think.
No, not by looking at India's renewable energy target, and we'll see what comes out of COP26 in that sense. Look, John, I think this has been such a fantastic discussion. Learnt so much from today, but looking now into 2022, as we've made the title of this webinar to look beyond this year and into 2022, do you think that our current government's bureaucracy, or DFAT obviously in particular being an important component of that, but do you think it's properly equipped and funded and functioning to sort of deliver this broad, diverse, growing agenda that both Australia and India have to go forward into 2022 and beyond?
Oh, look, we have the talent, but I think there's been a problem now, an increasing problem for at least a decade, whereby the bureaucracy, particularly the non-security bureaucracy, and DFAT is obviously relevant, have simply not been given the resources they need to work with these other, groups, be they companies or government departments, on the whole technology side. I mean, DFAT needs to work more on that with other groups as well. I mean, the whole trade and investment and the type of trade and investment that we undertake is really crucial, and we're not doing enough of it. Too much work is being done, and this is across the public service, by farming out bits and pieces to various companies and think tanks and so on. I think Australia needs a strong public service, and it needs a strong professional public service where people are staying in similar sorts of areas for long periods. If I have time, I'll just, you see, one thing that confuses me just as an individual, certainly not as an expert. We're getting into this submarine game, nuclear submarine game. We simply don't have people who are trained in any of that. Brits do, and the Americans, of course, do, and the French do. Yeah, sure. But, to get up to that level is going to take 15 years. So I know I'm digressing, but, you do need a very, very strong public service, and we've lost that, I think, to a significant degree. And we need to make sure that in looking at what our government requirements are going to be 10 years ahead, we bring the talent in. So, somebody knows what to do with a nuclear reactor. There wouldn't be too many people in Australia who do.
No, the depth of knowledge in our public service is crucial, I think, for the future of all of our relationships in the region to that extent. But look, John, this has been such a rich discussion, and I want to thank you so much for sharing your insights on the Australia-India relationship, your time as a diplomat, and also the sort of broader context of political, economic, and strategic issues that are in our Indo-Pacific region. I've learned so much today. It has been incredibly informative. So thank you. And thank you also to our audience for your questions.
Well,
thanks,
a great
John.
pleasure. Thank you, and thank your audience as well. Thank you.
For those that have registered for today's webinar, you will be sent a recording of it shortly. And for others, you can find it on the Australia-India Institute's website in the coming days. So thanks so much. It was a terrific discussion. Bye-bye.
Thank you.